Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Andrea Weckerly, and welcome to the Ready Living podcast, where each episode is designed to educate, inspire, and empower you to create the life you want. Thanks for joining us, and remember to subscribe for free on your favorite platform. My guest today is bibliotherapist, writer, and artist Ella Berthoud. She is the author with Susan Elderkin of The Novel Cure, an A to Z of literary remedies, and The Story Cure, an A to Z of books to keep kids happy, healthy, and wise. She has also written The Art of Mindful Reading and 30-Second Literature, the 50 Most Important Forms, Genres, and Styles, each explained in half a minute. As a bibliotherapist, Ella prescribes fiction tailored to each individual's life and circumstances, using the power of stories to help, heal, and invite reflection. Her work explores the transformative magic of literature, and she has spoken internationally about its therapeutic value. She also teaches art with a focus on pushing creative boundaries through color and shapes. She is passionate about unlocking well-being and creativity in others. Welcome, Ella.
Thank you, Andrea. It's really lovely to be here.
You have got to have one of the absolutely best jobs in the whole world. For people who might not be familiar with the term, can you explain what bibliotherapy is, share a little bit of its history, and tell us how you got started?
I agree, it's one of the best jobs in the whole world, and I love it. Bibliotherapy is the art of prescribing fiction to cure life's problems. And me and my friend Susan Elderkin thought that we had invented the idea and the term. We were very pleased with ourselves, thinking, ooh, isn't this a great idea? Let's bring books as medicine to the world. That was when we were at Cambridge University together. We took the idea of bibliotherapy to the School of Life in 2007, but then we started researching and realizing actually bibliotherapy's gone back to the time of Aristotle, and people have been prescribing books as medicine for a very, very long time, centuries. Though, of course, at that time they didn't have physical books, they were using drama as therapy instead. So, in the time of the ancient Greeks, they created theatres right next to hospitals so that people who were ill and going through physical ailments could go to the theatre and experience catharsis and be healed by the power of art. So, that was the earliest form of bibliotherapy as we perceive it, even though it wasn't actually reading. So, it was a little bit different. Bibliotherapy as a term actually goes back to the 1950s when men were coming back from the Second World War shell shocked, and doctors at that point started prescribing them books to read, particularly Jane Austen. She was seen as being a very healing person to read. We would probably not prescribe Jane Austen now for people coming back from war. I think their reasoning was quite sound in that they felt like Jane Austen was a symbol of predictability and things happening in the way that they're supposed to happen, in a sense. People in society do the things that they're supposed to do generally. Whereas, of course, for men going off to the Second World War, that was all completely destroyed and everything, all their morality and their ways of being were completely questioned. So I think that was the reasoning of giving them Jane Austen. That followed on into the 1960s. Doctors started prescribing books to children who are going through extreme emotional difficulties, like if their parents were divorcing. Doctors started prescribing them books to help them to see their lives in new ways and to find ways of being courageous and bold and self-confident through fiction. When me and Susan started the bibliotherapy service in 2007, we had the idea brewing for many years since we'd been at Cambridge when we were studying English literature about being book doctors and how we thought we should prescribe people different books for different life issues, like going through love difficulties or career issues or pondering whether to have children. So we'd been brewing the idea for ages, and then we bumped into Alain de Botton, who started the School of Life. We said we'd love to do bibliotherapy at School of Life. So that's when it began for us as a proper job and service. And we used to always do it one to one in the School of Life in this beautiful room, which had a couch where you could lie down like a proper therapy room and talk to us about your reading issues, anything that's going on in your life as well, what books you love, what books you dislike, and what are your kind of general reading habits. We would then probe and ask more about what's happening currently. Do you have any particular concerns right now, or any worrying issues, or any ailments? And then we would prescribe a selection of books, normally six, to cure those problems. We used to always do it in person, but then gradually we moved onto Skype and then eventually onto Zoom because we started seeing people globally, but also people gradually got more into doing things remotely anyway. Now it's almost purely online, though we do get people occasionally really keen to do an in person session. So we still do that if we can, and that's really lovely.
I read both fiction and nonfiction, enjoying them for different reasons. But I heard you say in an interview that you're a great believer in the idea of prescribing fiction rather than nonfiction because you feel that fiction has the advantage of being able to actually cure all of life's ailments if you have the right book at the right time. What, in your view, makes stepping into an invented world so powerful? And how exactly does bibliotherapy help people work through their challenges or problems?
Me and Susan both strongly believe that reading fiction affects you more deeply than reading non-fiction, because when you read a great novel, you actually become the characters that you're reading about. You live that life. It therefore affects you on a very deep level because you are effectively going through all their joys and tragedies and woes and triumphs as if you are that person. Luckily, you don't have to live through the deaths and tragedies and positives in a literal way, but because of the fact that you go through their extreme pain and joy, you are, in a way, able to live another life. And that gives you a completely different perspective on your own life. It's really genuinely transformative if you read the perfect novel at this time in your life, depending on what's going on in your life at this moment. Although nonfiction is great and has its place, it talks to your conscious brain, whereas fiction goes into your subconscious and heart. So you become the book. There's nothing like actually escaping into a story and being as one with the story to really change your life and perspective. How does it work with bibliotherapy? Well, people come to us for so many different reasons and at so many different life stages. Sometimes someone will have, for instance, lost someone they love very deeply, and they will be looking to bibliotherapy to help them. And on some occasions, people want to read more about grief. Other times, people would actually really just want to be fully distracted and escape into a totally different world and story. So every time we meet a new person, we need to get to know them and find out what it is they're hoping for, looking for in reading, and sort of find out if they've got any particular triggers, like if they've had a really difficult bereavement or if they might experience depression or suicidal thoughts. Then we have to be very conscious of trying not to trigger, obviously. It's always a very delicate process. We normally meet someone for an hour. We send a questionnaire first, which asks lots of very key questions about your reading habits and your life. That gives me a really great idea of where you are. Then we do the session for an hour. And then after that, I prescribe the books. We have follow up sessions if people are keen to do that. It does vary a lot according to the person. If the client loves romantic fiction or historical fiction or sci-fi or fantasy or great literary fiction, or if they really want to read Russian novels, etc., we have to be sort of ready for anything. But then also, as bibliotherapists, we feel one of our big aims is to broaden people's reading horizons. So if they are obsessed with fantasy, for instance, then I will always try and give them a book that's not fantasy just to get them into reading some other genres. Almost always they love it and have a new perspective, which is great.
In The Art of Mindful Reading, you wrote that our understanding of the world is shaped throughout our lives by reading and that this affects you on a fundamental level. How do you see this cumulative influence of reading playing out over a lifetime?
Well, I think it's very important to take into account what you read as a child, and your whole experience of reading as a child is really key to your later appreciation of reading. Hopefully, every parent wants their children to read and reads to them aloud as much as they possibly can. So that's a really fantastic foundation. And I always encourage people to carry on reading with their kids until they're adults, if possible, and even to read it aloud as adults to each other too. Of course, nowadays it's very difficult with phones getting in the way of people reading. I think there's a lot of kids nowadays who don't read so much as teenagers, but then they thankfully tend to rediscover books in adulthood, sort of early 20s, and realise that reading is fabulous. Often, I think, going back to the time that they were read to as kids and remembering what a lovely feeling that was. Going back to your question of how it plays out over a lifetime, with the clients that I meet who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of people love rereading books that they read as a teenager or child. So, for instance, I meet a lot of people that reread Jane Austen once a year, maybe Sense and Sensibility or Persuasion. Or there's often a key book that you might have read when you were 16, 17. Like for me, it's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And I love rereading that. Or like Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. If you read it every few years, it allows you to revisit the person that you were when you were younger, a means of time travel within your own life.
That is so interesting because right now I'm going through some of the books that I read as a teenager. I just got through the first book, and it's fascinating for me to see the story that I remember, but am experiencing now as an adult. Sometimes people consider reading fiction a purely leisurely or even frivolous pursuit. And in fact, in a Psychology Today article you wrote with Susan, you said that when we were growing up, reading novels was seen by many of our peers as a slightly indulgent way of passing the time. Why read a novel when we could be expanding our understanding of the world with nonfiction or informing ourselves about current affairs with a newspaper? Now we know for sure that the reader who finds and reads a novel will be a better person for it. Is there a growing recognition of this power?
I think there definitely is. There have been quite a lot of recent articles about fiction really helping develop empathy. There's an article in the Scientific American how reading fiction very clearly helps people develop empathy. An experiment was done where people had to read a short story before then doing a kind of exercise, which was sort of asking moral questions. And the people that had read the fiction had a far deeper understanding and empathy than the people that hadn't read the fiction. There's been quite a lot of those kinds of articles recently. There's also been articles about the long term health effects of reading and how it actually can add years to your life. So, not only are people understanding that fiction is key to developing emotional intelligence, but also people are understanding that reading is incredibly good for you physically as well. There was an article about how when you read, even for just 6 minutes a day, it has an incredibly profound effect on your brain and on your physiology because it slows your heart rate and your breathing. And they did experiments where they showed that the brain waves were moving in a kind of more slow, calm way when you read than just in normal life. Because there's also that thing about your eyes saccading from side to side as you read across the page that has a very profound effect on your well-being. They've done studies with men coming back from traumatizing situations from wars who have been given that therapy of the saccading eyes. I'm forgetting what it's called. And that is the same as when you're reading.
People have different ways of absorbing information about the world around them, whether that's auditory, visual, kinesthetic. Do these translate into what kind of books and what types of formats people might be drawn to?
Yes, so this is something I work with my bibliotherapy clients on as well. I get them to do an exercise where they read a passage and ponder what's going on in their brain. They think about whether they're experiencing the reading very visually or auditorily. So are they hearing a voice as they read, or even speaking the words aloud, or kinesthetically, meaning they dive into the book and they're almost literally living the book. Once you know what kind of reader you are, you will realize that it would benefit you to read different types of books. If you're very visual, then reading graphic novels is going to be a great idea. Or even if you have a very visual brain, perhaps enjoy books that really have rich descriptive passages, which some people hate because I think they have a different kind of brain where they just want to get on with the story. And then if you have a very auditory brain, listening to audiobooks is going to be perfect for you. And also reading aloud with a partner or friend. And then if you're very kinesthetic as a reader, so you're kind of literally living in the book, you might find that you actually want to do something physically while you're reading. I hula hoop while I read.
How does that work?
It just gets into a rhythm of just going round and round and round. And then I've got the book in my hands and I'm reading. I do that for kind of 20 minutes every evening, partly for exercise, partly because I actually love reading while moving. But also, I listen to loads of audiobooks. And that again works with hula hooping or walking or doing another task at the same time.
Earlier in our conversation, you were talking about reading aloud with a friend, for example. Can you expand a little bit on the different types of reading that we can do with others?
I'm a huge fan of reading aloud with a partner or friend. I always suggest that people should start off with short stories if you've never done it before, like David Eagleman's book Sum, which is 40 short stories, and they're only 3 pages long and they're great. If there's two of you reading, you take it in turns. So one of you reads a couple of pages, then passes it to the other person. They read a couple of pages. And the joy of reading aloud is that as the reader, you're being very generous to the listener, keeping them entertained and trying to perform in a way. And as the listener, you are giving your full attention to the reader. So it's very generous on both parts. And it's a very utterly unique experience of reading that short story because it's you two and your voices. And no two people are going to read the same story in the same way. And everyone will interpret it differently as well. Other ways of sharing reading are to be in the same room at the same time, maybe lying on the same sofa, but reading separate books. Thinking of when people are kind of separated by long distance, I've often suggested to people that they read the same book at the same time in their different countries or different places where they are.
That's a beautiful idea.
Yeah, so often mothers and daughters, or couples, or grandparents and grandchildren love it if you say read this same book over a period of a month, and then it means you can talk about it. And then also being outside reading together is something I really love. Being in a lovely park or garden and having a selection of blankets, or being in a tree, or being on a park bench. It's just really nice if there's a few of you gathering, whether it's a family or friends, and everyone just lying in the sun reading. Pretty heavenly.
How might the different ways someone moves through a book, whether reading it on their own or out loud with a friend, shape its therapeutic impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think if you're reading aloud with a friend, then that act in itself is therapeutic, whatever the book. But I think if you are either reading to yourself or listening to an audiobook, if you can be on your own reading a book and get fully immersed, that perhaps is like the ultimate therapeutic experience because in that situation, it's very easy to escape fully and just literally be living in that world. So I'm always telling people that they should have a reading nook in their house or in their flat or wherever they live, whatever it is, whether it's a hanging chair or just a cushion halfway up the stairs, which is the place you always go to read, or even a blanket you wrap around yourself and that's like your reading ritual. If you can have a kind of special reading place which is just for reading, then that sends a trigger to your brain that I am now reading, nothing's going to disturb me. And you leave your phone somewhere in another room, turn it off so you won't be disturbed. It doesn't have to be a fancy kind of library. Obviously, we'd all love that if we had the space. I mean, I listen to millions of audiobooks, and that's kind of a major part of my life. And I'm very often completely entranced by the audiobook. And I would always say to clients, if you can listen to an audiobook and be doing one thing like knitting or crocheting or being on a really long car journey, that's great because then you're in a bubble. And I've had some fabulous audio experiences while driving on big journeys. As you mentioned, I'm also a painter. So when I'm painting, I'm listening to audiobooks.
Is what you put on a canvas impacted by the novel you've chosen to listen to?
It is. There have been paintings I've done that have started off in one direction and have definitely been very much affected by the book that I'm listening to and kind of changed as they've gone along. Particularly with abstract landscapes, they definitely kind of take on the emotions of the book that I'm listening to. So I might start off thinking it's a lovely sort of spring vision of joy, and then I'm listening to some really intense, dark book, and it all becomes a lot darker.
Your book, The Novel Cure, goes through an entire alphabet listing of problems and issues people face. The A's alone cover things like abandonment, addiction, alcoholism, aging, anxiety, anger, angst, specifically existential angst, and also, more surprisingly, things like ambition, arrogance, attention seeking, and others. Arrogance you describe as one of the greatest crimes in literature, and I absolutely love that. How did you decide which topics to focus on, and how did you choose the best books to cure each ailment?
Basically, Susan and I spent a weekend when we first had the idea of the novel Cure, brainstorming and writing down every single novel we could think of that we wanted in the book because we knew it was a brilliant novel for whatever reason. Also, brainstorming every single ailment that we wanted to put in, from the obviously important ones such as loneliness and depression to the more kind of frivolous ones like determinedly chasing after a woman even though she's a nun.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Although, to be honest, that ailment came from the book. Exactly, that ailment is in Michael Ondaatje. That was Susan's. She was thinking, okay, we've got to get that in. So it was kind of quite personal to us to start with, because we were thinking, what books do we love the most and why? And which ailments people have that we want to address. We were sort of looking at our bookshelves, which we also did, and went through them and thought, okay, Jitterbug Perfume, for instance, which is one of my favourite novels, Tom Robbins, what would that be a great cure for? And obviously, all our favourite novels, you can probably think of 10 or 20 different things that they could cure because they're full of such great ideas. We sort of discussed it and narrowed it down. And then also we put it out to extended acquaintances, friends, family, and academic world, people that we knew in the world of literature, and kind of said, what book would you want to include and what would you suggest it as a cure for? And then we started sending out books to friends as well, saying, do you think this book would work as a cure for X? We obviously had to have both read the book before we could write the cure. So it was all very time consuming. We proposed it to Canongate and they said, okay, brilliant, we'd love you to do it. Can you do it in a year? We really felt like we needed 2 years, but we did manage to get it done in 18 months. But yeah, it was pretty epic.
In one of your YouTube videos, you talk about how literature can help someone deal with fury, referring to your book, The Novel Cure, where you describe rage as the hottest, fieriest emotion there is. Your vision turns red and you cannot think logically. You become a tsunami, wreaking havoc on everything around you. You note that rage will frighten those who witness it and may make those who love you feel unsafe around you, and that it will deplete you, leaving you a little more broken, a little less noble in heart than before. You therefore say it should be nipped in the bud at its first appearance and before it becomes a habit. We're seeing a lot of rage around the world these days, and I want to be clear, I'm not referring to righteous anger, but destructive rage. What are some books you might recommend for people who want to stop being enslaved by rage?
Yeah, that's a great question. One I recommend to people a lot is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, because that is, I feel, a book that describes the opposite of rage. It describes a man who should, in some ways, be utterly enraged because he's having an incredibly, almost impossible time trying to catch this fish. And then he does catch the fish, and then the sharks eat the fish, and it's all a sort of completely pointless journey. And he's nearly dying anyway because he's old. But the thing is, he's incredibly stoical and incredibly accepting. I think he's a really great example of being noble in the face of terrible bad luck. So I think he's a really fantastic inspiration for avoiding rage, really. Another one which I think is great and which I have prescribed people quite often is Shane by Jack Schaefer. It's kind of an American classic, which is now seen as a YA novel, but I give it to adults as well. It's about a man who is incredibly calm in the face of terrible obstacles, and he kind of overcomes the obstacles by going at them in a very slow and steady, unruffled fashion. By example, he shows us how not to be stupidly enraged. Another one that comes to mind of a more modern variety, perhaps, is the really interesting book Night Bitch by Rachel Yoder. So that, in a way, is a book about female rage, about a woman who has a baby. She's an artist and she is increasingly frustrated by her lot in life. And it's set in the present day. And the fact that the art world is all run by men and the world of being a mother seems very unfair on the female sex. She ends up doing everything around the house, as is so often the case. And she transforms at night into a dog, which is a surprise because it's a very sort of modern, kind of sassy New York style book. You'd see this woman being an artist. And then one night she starts sort of growing her teeth and getting a shaggy tail. And she's as shocked as anyone else. And then it turns out that she's running around the streets with a lot of other women from the neighborhood who are also transforming into dogs at night. The way that her rage is transmuted is by literally metamorphosing into a creature of the night.
In an interview you gave during the Boston Book Festival a couple of years ago, you said that reading is one of the best ways of staying calm. But right now, we're seeing a lot of social and political upheaval and challenging times. So, are there any particular books or book genres that are more comfortable than others?
Really great question. It does depend on your reading comfort zone yourself, because some people love romantic novels. I love them at times because I think they're just incredibly calming, a bit like reading a Jane Austen novel a couple of hundred years ago, because they're romantic stories where you know that the right people are going to get together in the end, and they go through all kinds of traumas on the way, but you rest assured that it's all going to work out. And that's something really very reassuring. By the same token, some people love detective fiction. With most detective novels, you know that the baddie will get his comeuppance and you'll go through some sort of difficult pathways on the way, but it will almost certainly end satisfyingly. Also, fantasy, a lot of people love to escape into because it's just a completely different world where they can go in their heads and live in another version of reality. Historical fiction is another genre that people love to go to because going back a couple of hundred years or even 500 years or even kind of Clan of the Cave Bears world, which is a couple of thousand years ago, is really great. The things that I see most commonly are people loving either romantic fiction, detective fiction, or historical fiction as a sort of comfort read. I also meet people reading poetry as a form of calm and escape as well.
In looking at your YouTube channel, the books you recommend range from classic to modern works. By the way, for all the listeners out there, Ella's YouTube channel covers a plethora of things, such as secrets in literature, rescues in literature, imposters in literature, great road trips in literature, and so on. What are the criteria you use to determine whether a book is worthy of being recommended?
Sometimes it's purely because it's a current book that I'm obsessed with and I really want to tell the world because I've just read it. I get sent books as well. So if there's a book that's just been released, like the new book by Kit Duvall, I'm assured it's going to be good because I know her work. And then the other criteria are whether I think people are going to really benefit from reading it in whatever way. I don't want to say that every book I recommend has to have a kind of upbeat, healing property because then it would be a bit unreal. But I think my criteria would be, is it something I can be immersed in and that my clients are going to be immersed in? Is it something that they're going to be pleased to have read? So, for instance, there's a new novel based on Moby Dick called Call Me Ishmael by Xiaolu Guo, which I absolutely loved. And it's a fantastic story. That's sort of primarily why I'd recommend it because it takes you on the story. But then also it's fantastic because it is a new spin on Moby Dick. There's a really great female character who's very empowered and empowering. So I'd say being immersed, feeling pleased that you've read it, and being a great story. I suppose that those are the three major criteria.
Beyond the books that you've personally already read, what outside sources do you trust when searching for the next great remedy? And what are some good sources you would recommend others use to identify for themselves? And how do you stay on top of all the magnificent books available in the world? Because I admit that for me, a great tragedy is that I realize one lifetime is not long enough to read all the books I would like to read.
There's a brilliant radio program that I listen to called A Good Read, which is a program where the presenter chooses two interesting people who might be actors or writers or sports people, people of note for whatever reason. They choose a book each, which then the three people in the program discuss. And they quite often disagree on whether they like the book or not. And the book they choose can be any book. The great thing about that is they're often more obscure books. They might be books from today or 100 years ago. So I'm often introduced to new books I would never have read. Then there's also the Guardian newspaper reviews. I read them, Times Literary Supplement, and the New Yorker. I read all of them or listen to their podcasts about the latest books that are coming out. So many clients tell me, you've got to read this book. So I always write that down as well. Writing a reading notebook. It's something that I totally urge people to do because it means that you keep a note of the books that you've read and what you think of them and books that are recommended to you as well. So the idea of a reading notebook is it's a small book that you preferably carry around with you. On the day that you finish the book that you're reading, you write down in it the title of the book, author, place you read it, and it will all come back to you how you felt about it. And then a few thoughts about the book. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you wish that character hadn't died? Did it resonate with you for whatever reason? And that means that you've encapsulated what it is about the book that you loved or didn't like. And lots of people I talk to say, oh, well, I do something like that with Goodreads or with an app, which is great. But I would also say if you can physically write it down, that goes in deeper into your brain.
Right. It's definitely a different experience. And so you were talking about keeping this notebook so people can find out what they like, what they don't like. Do our reading tastes change over time? And if so, what's the reason behind that?
To terribly generalize, men often read much more nonfiction than fiction. I also meet quite a lot of men who did read fiction when they were younger, and then as they get older, they just want to read nonfiction because they want to keep abreast of current events or understand history, etc. That happens with quite a lot of women as well. I do find as people get older, they're less tolerant sometimes of experimental fiction. So when people are writing in stream of consciousness styles, or if they're interweaving stories and there's lots of different timelines, then people can get a bit impatient with that. So I think people do change a lot, and also they change a lot due to circumstance. When someone is going through a period of mourning, then they quite often can't handle a massive literary work. They might want to just read something that's really undemanding and easy and just read some sort of really predictable detective novels or whatever. But that isn't true for everyone because I also meet people who want to kind of read something deeply thought provoking and poetic. People also change according to their jobs. So depending on if they've got the time to read, because I meet a lot of people that said, I used to read all the time when I was in my 20s, but now I'm doing this really demanding job. I wish I could read more. And then I help them find times and places. And it really helps, I think, giving people suggestions. People slightly just get out of the habit and then think, I'm never going to get back into reading. And then they're just sort of scrolling on their phone.
Sometimes we start a book and find it's an unpleasant struggle. You suggest people apply what you call the 50-page rule. Can you tell us about that?
Me and Susan came up with the idea of the 50-page rule, which is that you persevere for 50 pages and then see how it goes. If it's only 10, it's not long enough to really get absorbed. And if it's 100, that's probably too much. And you can normally tell within that period of time whether you're going to like it or not. If you decide, actually, this is not working for me, put it down, but put it somewhere where you're going to come across it again a few months later, maybe 6 months later, and then pick it up again and give it another go. I've done that quite often with books when I've not liked it and put it down, and then for whatever reason, it suddenly works at this later stage.
Reading for me has been a lifelong way to feed an insatiable curiosity about life and the world. And your love of reading also sounds like it started young. In The Art of Mindful Reading, you wrote that your mother was your first role model for reading, and it was her default entertainment, and that she was never without a book. Can you share with us a little bit about the beautiful story about a family car trip you took from Iran to Finland when you were 5 years old?
My dad was a diplomat. I was therefore lucky enough to grow up in lots of fabulous places. So I was born in South Africa and then we lived in Iran. We had to go to Finland because it was my dad's next posting. And my parents were adventurers and we used to go camping in lots of wonderful places in Iran, for instance, in the desert, which was amazing. And so they decided to drive to Finland and we went through Turkey and other places, but we drove in two different cars. I think that was because we were taking stuff with us. I've got three brothers, but it was just me and my youngest brother. And at one point, we got separated by a earthquake.
Oh, dear.
I know, and that was in the days when there were no mobile phones. My parents were in two different cars and separated by this earthquake and not knowing if everything was okay. So that was pretty dramatic. We were only separated for a day. But during that car journey, that was when I learned to read. My parents obviously brought lots of picture books, Tintin books and Dr. Seuss, etc. And I really clearly remember lying on the back of the parcel shelf on the Wolseley 1300, which was a really lovely old car, saying to my brother, "Look, I can read," when I probably couldn't really.
Oh.
But I was copying the letters, basically, and slowly working it out. I do remember some of the words beginning to click into place. My parents were big readers, and my mum read all the time, as we were saying before, but also my dad used to read aloud to us all the time. So we had a lot of camping expeditions in the desert where dad would be reading to us from Sherlock Holmes short stories. And we'd be in the outback in Australia with a fire in the middle of nowhere reading Sherlock Holmes. And that, that was a magical thing. I've tried to do similar things with my kids.
Today, we're talking about the power of reading and the positive impact that books can have on our lives. But I think it's important to mention that some books can be traumatizing. What makes a book traumatizing presumably varies by reader, but I imagine some of the common elements might include things like graphic depictions of violence or abuse, death of animals, children, or innocent characters, are books that strip away all hope, meaning, or human connection. How do you define a traumatizing book versus a book that is heavy because it deals with serious or even disturbing subject matter?
It's one of those things that's personal to different people. Some people will find a book traumatizing, which others will just find kind of curious. There are books with hideous imagery, such as The White Hotel by D.M. Thomas. There are some horribly traumatizing books about the Nazis. And for me, that book, The White Hotel, was a traumatizing book because it's got some just awful images that you'd never want to have in your brain. And once they're in your brain, you can't get rid of them. Another book that I'd put in that category would be American Psycho, because there's just hideous images, which are vile. But I guess some people can filter out the horror and take it with a pinch of salt. But there's definitely a few books like that which I would never prescribe to someone because I feel they're too potentially harmful, really.
It's the book equivalent of a snuff film.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's something about reading a book which is almost worse than seeing the film because you imagine the images in your head. But then going back to books about Nazi Germany, a book like The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, which also has lots of really distressing images in it, is actually a very optimistic, positive book in some ways, even though it's full of death. It's got the personification of death, and that personification is very benign, and you feel almost accepting of death because he's so sorrowful about what he's doing. And also the sort of stories of hope that run through the book, which sort of counter the trauma that you're reading about. Everyone reacts to things differently, but as a bibliotherapist, I would never prescribe something that I would imagine might be triggering or traumatizing in some way.
And in one of your YouTube videos, you talk about antidote literature, namely reading another book to cure a book that traumatizes you. What is your method for pairing a traumatic read with an antidote, and how might somebody identify an antidote on their own?
it's quite a difficult thing to do because once you've read the traumatizing book, you're traumatized. And so it's quite difficult to heal yourself with the right antidote book. But for instance, something like Watership Down by Richard Adams, which is a very traumatizing book.
Which I did read, and I was wondering whether I should reread. I'm still debating that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it is actually a brilliant book, but it is very, very sad, and people have been known to weep for days afterwards. To find the antidote, you want a kind of equivalent book that has the opposite effect. So, with Watership Down, you witness to lots of rabbits being murdered by humans in awful ways through farming technology, really. I would say a great antidote would be My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell, because that's a book all about animals in a very positive, lovely, benign way, where the humans are really kind to the animals. The sort of equal and opposite effect is what I would recommend. Talking about the White Hotel, which is traumatizing and awful, hideous imagery from the Second World War, I would perhaps prescribe The Book Thief, because that is a kind of equal and opposite, because it's still about the Second World War. I mean, it's not exactly positive because awful things happen, but there is a better outcome.
The Book Thief is brilliant. On a personal note, I heard that you love Moominland Midwinter and that it's one of your favorite books and that you fell in love with them when you were 8 years old and have loved them ever since. In fact, I have Moominland Midwinter on my bookshelf too as part of my book collection. What makes you love the Moomins and the Moomin world so much?
I think it's partly personal because we did live in Finland, which is where the Moomins come from. And my mum discovered the Moomin books then and she read them to us. That was when I was 8. And she was so in love with the Moomins that grew my love of them. I think they're fantastic because they're so good for adults as well as for children because they're all about people having quirky, strange issues. They have like seasonal depressive disorder, not that it's described as that, or they're kind of really OCD. The Hemulin is a sort of cross-dressing, finicky, really strange person. You just really relate to the creatures and see them as people, really. They're kind of quite mournful in a way. They're quite sad at times. Like Moomin Valley in November is all about the depression of winter. But then they're also full of fun and they're quite frivolous and playful. And Moomin Troll is a sort of innocent, playful character. They're so imaginative. They are a really great mixture of the happy and the sad in a quite realistic way. But also, they take you to this beautiful place, which is Moomin Valley, which we all want to live there, probably. How did you discover the Moomins?
I had read the book when I was a teenager. It was so fantastical. There were things in there that just made me laugh, some things that I remembered thinking were bizarre, and it was just this new, delightful little world. But I want to get to the point about the importance of movement books. I know you prescribe them to people of all ages, adults more than children, in fact, I've heard you say. Besides the movement books, are there any other books traditionally designated as children's books that carry value for adults as well? I'm thinking, for example, of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, which I first read as a child and then again as an adult and really enjoyed it.
Yes, me too. And I think they're great. You go through a lot of terrible events, but then things come good in the end. And moral justice wins the day, and you feel like everything's right with the world. But other ones I quite often recommend are The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. It's a really beautiful book with hope as a kind of central theme. It's just strangely magical, even though it's on the surface quite a sad story to start with. Also, The Giver by Lois Lowry, kind of YA or maybe 11 up. And it's about a boy who has to kind of take on all the memories of the world because everyone else lives in a sort of grey world where they don't have memories of either joy or sadness. And that's sort of what enables them to live in this rather depressing world. So he has all the sort of happy memories of like sledging through the snow, but also all the sad, terrible memories of bad things that happen. He kind of stores all those up and what happens to him, then how he changes the world for the better. Other ones I sometimes recommend to people are Emil and the Detectives, Eric Kastner. I love his books, and they're just great stories because they're funny, they're witty, and the kids in them are really clever and charismatic, and the right people win in the end of the story. And then again, just briefly, graphic novels that I love. Brian Selznick, he writes very beautifully, and he writes as much with his drawings as he does with his writing. And so there are visual feasts as well as imaginative feasts through words.
Let's say somebody wants to build a reading habit but isn't sure how to find the time. What advice do you give them?
I try and identify with them the times of the day when they might be able to read, even if it's only 5 or 10 minutes at a time. I help them to build up a routine in which they have more time to read. If you never read, just try reading for 5 minutes at your lunch break. If you can make it 10 minutes, all the better. Alternatively, read on your way home, commuting, if you're on a tube, etc. If you're in a car, listen to an audiobook. Or even try reading in the bath, if that's an option. Try and find snatches of time when you can read. Don't feel like you've got to suddenly read for 2 hours at a time. Your reading brain is a muscle. So just start with something short. Just think, okay, I'm going to read 3 pages. And then next week, I'll try and read 5 pages at a time. And then the next week, I'll read 10. Like any kind of exercise, you just rebuild slowly, a few minutes at a time, until you then realize, actually, I can sit down for half an hour and read, or even an hour. The book nook idea really helps. So, having the place to read, by designating a physical space to read, that gives you the clear intention that you want to read.
Where can people find you online to learn more about your work?
So I've got a website, ellaberthoud.com, which has both my bibliotherapy writing and my painting sides of my life. I'm also on Instagram, Infinite Ella Berthoud, and then I'm also on YouTube under Ella Berthoud. People can book a bibliotherapy session with me directly through my website, and I can do one-to-one sessions on Zoom, and I can do one-off bibliotherapy sessions, or I can do a package of a few.
Ella, thank you so much for having taken the time today.
Thank you.